Drake and Daniel both decided to try the same budgeting rule for 30 days. 50% needs, 30% wants, 20% savings. Same rule, same starting line. By day 10, one of them was actually sticking to it, and the other one's numbers stopped making sense before the second week even started. This isn't really a story about willpower. It's a story about what happens when a simple rule meets real numbers, and what to do when the math genuinely doesn't fit. Before we get into what actually happened, if real budgeting experiments like this are useful to you, hit subscribe, new video every week. The 50-30-20 rule splits after-tax income into 3 buckets. 50% to needs, housing, food, utilities, minimum debt payments, and transportation. 30% to wants, dining out, entertainment, subscriptions, shopping, and 20% to savings and debt repayment. Your emergency fund, retirement contributions, and any extra debt payments beyond the minimum. The rule was popularized in 2005 by then Harvard Law professor Elizabeth Warren and her daughter Amelia Warren Tyagi in their book All You're Worth. Worth noting, honestly, there's some debate over whether Warren actually invented this exact framework or simply packaged it into the version that caught on. But she's the name most associated with making it mainstream. There's also an official alternative version for tighter budgets, 60-20-20, with needs allowed to expand to 60% and wants trimmed to 20%, built specifically for situations where a 50% needs cap simply isn't realistic. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because it's exactly where this experiment ends up. Day 1 for both of them was the same exercise. Pull last month's bank statement and highlight every single transaction as a need, a want, or savings. It sounds simple. In practice, it's the part almost everyone gets stuck on. Some categories split down the middle within themselves. Groceries are mostly a need, but the snack aisle and the impulse candy bar at checkout are arguably a want. And being honest about that split matters more than most people expect once the percentages start adding up. Subscriptions are almost always a want, even the ones that feel essential by now. A streaming service, a gym membership you're not using enough, an app subscription you forgot existed. If cutting it wouldn't put your housing or your health at risk, it's a want, no matter how routine it feels. Before either of them even got to a single dollar amount, there were 3 setup mistakes worth naming, because they trip up almost everyone running this exercise for the first time. The first, using gross income instead of take-home pay as the base number. The rule is built on after-tax income specifically, and running the percentages against a gross paycheck inflates every single bucket target past what's actually achievable. The second mistake, forgetting irregular expenses that don't show up in a typical month. Car registration, an annual insurance premium, a holiday gift season, a once-a-year subscription renewal. Skip these in the setup and they show up as a surprise overspend 2 or 3 months in, even though nothing about the budget itself actually changed. The third, treating 1 month's numbers as a permanent plan. Income and expenses shift, a freelance month, unpaid overtime, a slow retail season, and a percentage-based budget has to get rerun against the actual month it's covering, not copy-pasted forward indefinitely. Here's where the experiment ran into the real world. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey, the average U.S. household spent $78,535 in 2024, about $6,545 a month, against an average pre-tax income of $104,207. Of that spending, housing alone averaged 33.4%, $2,189 a month. Transportation averaged another 17.0%. $1,110 a month. Add those 2 categories together, and you're already at 50.4% of the average household's total spending before a single dollar of food, utilities, or debt payments even gets counted. That's not a Drake-specific problem. That's the national average. For a huge number of Americans, needs, just the 2 biggest categories of needs, already consume the entire needs bucket before food, insurance, utilities, or minimum debt payments are added on top of it. It gets worse depending on where you live. These are national averages. Someone in a lower cost of living area might comfortably fit needs under 50%, while someone in an expensive metro area can blow past 60 or 70% on housing and transportation alone, through no fault of their own budgeting. Renting versus owning changes this further. A renter's housing cost is a fixed, unavoidable need with no equity attached. A homeowner's mortgage payment counts the same way in this budget, even though part of it is building equity rather than simply disappearing, which is worth remembering before assuming a high housing percentage is automatically a problem rather than, in a homeowner's case, partly a forced form of the savings bucket itself. Drake tried to force his real numbers into the strict 50-30-20 split. His rent and car payment alone already ate past 50% of his income. Instead of adjusting the rule, he started reclassifying things to make the math work on paper. By week 2, takeout on a night he was too tired to cook got quietly moved from wants into needs. A subscription he'd had for 3 years got the same treatment, because it didn't feel optional anymore, even though nothing about it was actually essential. The categories didn't change. His honesty about which bucket things belonged in did. The result? His needs and wants buckets both quietly ballooned by reclassification and the 20% savings bucket. The one bucket nobody can fudge by relabeling a receipt ended up the one that actually shrank. He hit 30 days technically following 50-30-20 on paper, while saving almost nothing in reality. This is the single most common way the rule fails in practice. It's rarely that people ignore the categories entirely, it's that the categories get quietly bent until the math looks right, which defeats the entire point of tracking anything in the first place. For context on where a realistic wants bucket actually goes, nationally, food accounts for about 13% of the average household budget, and that splits roughly half and half between groceries, mostly a need, and dining out, which is mostly a want. The rest of a typical household spending breaks down to roughly 8% healthcare, 5% entertainment, 3% clothing, 2% education, and about 19% everything else: insurance, personal care, miscellaneous costs that don't fit neatly into a single bucket. When Drake's actual want spending, the honest version, before reclassification, got compared against these national averages, his entertainment and dining out total alone was running higher than the entertainment, clothing, and education categories combined. Nationally, that gap is what a 30-day tracking exercise is actually built to surface. Part of that gap was invisible until the receipts were actually laid out side by side. A $5 streaming add-on here, a $10 app subscription there, none of them individually dramatic, but stacked together across a month, they quietly outweighed a single larger, more obvious purchase. This is sometimes called subscription creep, and a 30-day tracking exercise is one of the few things that reliably catches it. Since none of these charges feel significant enough on their own to notice without writing every one of them down in the same place. Daniel ran into the identical problem. His housing and transportation also crossed 50% on their own. His response was different. Instead of relabeling receipts, he switched to the official 60-20-20 alternative on day 4. Once the math made it clear the standard version wasn't realistic for his actual cost of living, that one change let every category keep its honest label. Rent stayed a need. Dining out stayed a want. Nothing got quietly reclassified to make a percentage work. The percentage moved instead, which is exactly what the 60-20-20 version exists for. The one number Daniel refused to touch was the 20% savings and debt bucket. Needs could expand under the 60-20-20 version, wants could shrink to compensate, but the savings percentage stayed fixed the entire month, because that's the bucket that actually determines whether the 30 days produced anything real. It's worth being clear that switching to 60-20-20 wasn't Daniel giving up on the stricter version. It was a calibration decision, made on real numbers rather than wishful ones, on day 4 instead of day 30. The alternative, staying nominally on 50-30-20 while quietly bending categories to fit, produces a budget that looks stricter on paper while actually accomplishing less in practice, which is exactly what happened on the other side of this experiment. Part of that 20% is meant to build an emergency fund targeted at 3 to 6 months of living expenses. Based on the median U.S. monthly household expense of about $5,100 in 2023, that puts a typical target emergency fund somewhere between $15,300 and $30,600. That fund belongs in a high-yield savings account, not a checking account earning close to nothing. 4 to 5% AP was a realistic range in 2024 and 2025. And the general order of operations matters. Build this fund before investing more aggressively, with one specific exception: always capture a full employer 401k match first. Since that's an immediate return, nothing else in this video can match. By day 30, Daniel's emergency fund had grown by a real specific amount because his 20% bucket stayed intact all month. Drake's had grown by almost nothing, not because he earned less, but because his 20% bucket absorbed the damage from everything he'd quietly reclassified upstream. One practical detail that made Daniel's month easier to stick to: he didn't just track the 3 buckets on a spreadsheet, he built them into separate accounts. One checking account for needs, a second for wants, and the emergency fund sitting in its own dedicated high-yield savings account, funded automatically the day his paycheck landed. That structure removes a decision from every single purchase. Instead of asking whether something fits the wants budget every time a card gets swiped, the wants account simply runs out when the 30% is spent, and there's no ambiguity left to negotiate with in the moment. Drake tracked everything in a single account and did the math after the fact, which left far more room for exactly the kind of reclassification that derailed his month. For people who find 50-30-20 or even 60-20-20 too loose to actually work, there's a stricter alternative: zero-based budgeting. Every single dollar of income gets assigned a specific job in advance. Expenses, plus savings, plus investments, has to equal total income, with nothing left unaccounted for. It's more restrictive than percentage-based budgeting, and it takes more upfront setup, but it's specifically the most effective option for people who tend to overspend, since there's no leftover, unassigned money sitting around waiting to disappear. Yanab and EveryDollar are 2 of the more commonly used apps built around this exact method. The trade-off is time. A percentage-based budget can be set up in an afternoon and mostly left alone. Zero-based budgeting typically means a short planning session at the start of every single pay period, assigning that period's income before any of it gets spent. For someone who's already disciplined about categories, that extra step can feel unnecessary. For someone who keeps finding money missing at the end of the month with no clear explanation, it's often the difference between a budget that survives past week 1 and one that doesn't. After 30 days, Daniel finished with his 60-20-20 split holding steady, an emergency fund genuinely larger than when he started, and an honest picture of exactly where his money went. Drake finished having technically hit his percentages on paper, while his real savings barely moved and several categories had been quietly relabeled to make that paper version work. Neither of them ran a perfect month. Daniel still went over his trimmed wants bucket twice, once for a car repair he'd misclassified as a want before catching it. Once for an honest impulse purchase he simply logged instead of hiding. The difference wasn't flawless execution. It was that his overspending stayed visible in the numbers instead of getting absorbed into a relabeled category where it couldn't be addressed. Both of them followed a version of 50-30-20. Only one of them followed it honestly enough for it to actually change anything. The percentages themselves were never really the point. 50-30-20 and 60-20-20 are both legitimate versions of the same tool. The number that matters is whichever one accurately reflects your real cost of living, not whichever one looks best on a chart. What actually separated Daniel's month from Drake's wasn't the exact split he chose. It was whether every transaction got labeled honestly, and whether the savings bucket specifically stayed untouched no matter what had to give elsewhere. That's also the part a 30-day experiment can't shortcut. A single week of data is too easy to explain away as an unusual week. A full month, covering at least one full pay cycle and most recurring bills, is close to the minimum needed to see whether a budget reflects real life or just a good first week, which is exactly why this format ran the full 30 days instead of stopping early once the numbers looked encouraging. The 50-30-20 rule splits income into needs, wants, and savings, but the national averages show housing and transportation alone already cross 50% of spending for a typical household, which is exactly why the official 60-20-20 alternative exists. The rule that actually works is whichever version you can follow honestly for 30 real days, not the one that looks cleanest on day 1. 30 days won't fix a budget by itself. But it will tell you, with real numbers instead of a guess, exactly which bucket is actually the problem. This video is for educational purposes only and is not personalized financial advice. If real budgeting experiments like this one are useful, subscribe. New video every week. Next time, the one investing rule that actually builds wealth and why so many people quietly break it at the worst possible moment.